Sometimes life gives us lemons. Sometimes it gives us lemonade. Other times it gives us something entirely out of left field that makes us say, WTF. But no matter what obstacles come, there is most often a way out on the other side, and we are once again victorious. My name is Dr. Rowe, and you are listening to my podcast about resilience. Every guest shares a tragedy to triumph story to give listeners like you the inspiration to push through every single day. Listen now as my next guest shares how they were life-jacked.
What do you do when food takes over your life in a negative way instead of a positive way? My name is Dr. Rowe, and this is Life-Jacked, the Resilience Podcast. Life-Jacked is when an unfortunate or unplanned event happens to jack with your life. My guest for this week, Patty Cabot, who for 20 years battled drastic weight fluctuations and thought it prevented her from having romantic relationships. Desperate to break the cycle and open herself to love, she found a therapist that specialized in eating disorders. The therapist believed her weight was a symptom of a much deeper issue, childhood sexual abuse. Patty learned that by resolving this issue, it could allow her to have the love she wanted and deserved. Her recently published memoir, Not That Girl Anymore, details her breakthrough from trauma to triumph. Hi, Patty. Welcome. Thank you so much for being a guest on my show. How are you?
Hi, Dr. Rose. Thank you so much for having me. I am delighted to be here with you. I am doing very well today. How are you?
I am doing awesome. I have been so excited about the March Madness and the Final Four, especially for the women. Most people are excited about the men, but I've been just floored and blown away, especially as a former athlete, and it's just that the women are just rocking it.
They certainly are.
Yes. All right, so you struggled for many years with an eating disorder. What was your specific struggle with food?
So I was a binge eater. So starting in my teens, I would gain and lose anywhere from 50 to 75 pounds every 2 years, and I did it like clockwork. So I would either eat in a very disciplined kind of way, or I would run hog wild, and such as the nature of binging. And I would say I did not know it at the time, but people who have been sexually abused as children, while you can have an eating disorder of any stripe, binge eating is most commonly associated with childhood sexual abuse.
Wow, for 20 years. So since your teen, with your weight fluctuating, 50 to 75 pounds is not a small amount. So did anyone notice or say anything, but you just kind of brushed it under the rug like a lot of people do? Did anybody notice?
I don't know that it's that people didn't notice, but I think that it wasn't probably a conversation that I would have been receptive to. So I was tortured by my weight. So when I was heavy, I was desperately unhappy about the fact that I was heavy. So I think I was always aware of the fact that I was gaining and losing and gaining and losing. So I don't think anybody thought I wasn't aware.
Got it. And so in the binge eating, so for the listeners who kind of don't know sometimes how these eating disorders work, so at one point in time, you're binge eating, right? So you're eating and just whatever, right? Whatever you want. And then it's like a cycle, right? And then you go through the next phase of this cycle, and then what happens in that part?
So I would say binging can really vary. It's like everything is so individual based to who each of us are. And I would say binging, I think, is more than just overeating, because I think people who don't have eating disorders overeat. Even my shrink who, we'll talk about, she had said to me at one point, she's like, everybody overeats at certain points. Binging becomes almost compulsive. So for me, if I was binging, particularly once I was on my own, out of school, in my own apartment where I had free reign over coming and going and who was in and who was out in my kitchen, I would say. And I also, at that point in my life, I smoked cigarettes. I was also a pothead. and I would lock myself away in my apartment, and I would literally get all of my favorite treats, and I am all about sugar. And I could have a dozen donuts, a pint of ice cream, a bag of candy, and I would just eat and eat and eat. And even if I felt sick, I wouldn't stop. And so when I was binging, it was kind of like this just really all mentality. And as a whole, I tended to be very black or white. So when I wasn't binging, when I was kind of not in a binge cycle, I was extraordinarily disciplined, which is how I was able to gain and lose weight, so much weight with such regularity. And, not an overnight kind of time frame, but, to gain 50 to 75 pounds every 2 years, you're gaining, you're losing, you're gaining, you're losing. I was just one extreme or the other.
So any time during that, did you notice that you were in this cycle? I mean, we're talking before you before you went to a therapist and everything, and you were in this, like I said, 20 years. Wow. So did you ever know anything?
I mean, I definitely knew I was doing it, but I didn't know why. I really didn't know. And I think that's part of the compulsion of it, is like that you're doing it, and I would hate myself for it. I hated gaining weight, and I hated the way I looked, and I was miserable. And it's not rocket science to lose weight, right? It's really not. And especially because I was so very good at losing weight, I could not figure out why it was that I couldn't maintain it. I just really couldn't connect the dots on it. So I was always aware that it was a problem. And it's like, I had quit smoking, I want to say 8 times before it was the last time. And I haven't smoked in 20 years. So, I mean, that's great, but it's been more than 20 years at this point. But every time you do something like this, I think for anybody, whether it's drugs, alcohol, whatever it is you give up, dieting, you're always convinced it's going to be the last time, right? Like you're going to learn, you're going to put it into action. It's the last time, but it just never, so I was always hopeful, but it was just never the last time.
Right. Which would make sense why then you decided, hey, you know what, maybe I should go to a therapist and help me out. And in visiting therapy, your therapist helped you discover that your eating disorder was actually tied to past sexual trauma. So after learning this, did it help, like, how did it help resolve anything? I mean, did anything kind of show up for you, any memories? Did you start having flashbacks? What was that, revelation like?
So when I started seeing my therapist, and again, I very specifically looked for somebody who dealt with eating disorders, because at this point now I'm in my late 30s and I was just exhausted, because I thought, you know what, this is going to be me for the rest of my life unless I figure out what is driving it, because it really was very unknown to me why I behaved in the way that I did, because I had great intentions. So when I started seeing my therapist, and anybody who's ever been in therapy, you kind of meet somebody and they kind of go through your history and, to understand how you grew up, like what your life is like, where, kind of what your day-to-day is like. And we talked about my childhood sexual abuse. So my childhood sexual abuse was always known to me. So it wasn't like anything really resurfaced for me, but I never dealt with it. Never, never, never. I never... and even in those days, so I am 57, and in those days, it was my stepfather was my primary abuser, and my mother ultimately divorced him. In those days, you didn't really go to therapy, so kind of once he was out of my life, it was as if it never happened, kind of a thing. So what do children do when they have their own things that they're trying to make sense of? They make sense of it in their own way. And if something's really painful, what's the natural instinct? You just bury it away and never think about it again. So when I started working with my therapist, it really was the first time in my life that I ever really acknowledged what had happened and set about to resolve it. And it was a big shock to me when she said my weight was a symptom of that, because honestly, Dr. Rowe, I could have had until the end of time and I was never going to make the connection.
Wow. So I believe that as I was doing the research for your episode, and you said that the therapist used a technique called EMDR. I don't remember exactly, but it was EMDR, and I can't remember what it stands for, but you could perhaps share that. So what exactly is, this particular method, and how is it beneficial?
Yeah, so it's called EMDR, which, again, I had never heard of when I went to see my therapist. She specialized in eating disorders, but she also specialized in EMDR, and EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And this is ideal for people who have experienced trauma. And basically what it is so it relies on bilateral stimulation, so left brain, right brain. So walking, running, those are like kind of left brain, right brain, or bilateral activities. So the doctor or the therapist can either use chimes in your hands, you can use headphones with ping in opposite ears, or they can tap on your knees, and we use the headphones. And basically what it's supposed to do, so if you have trauma in your life, and if you think of your brain and your mind working like trains on a track, when you have trauma, it's an explosion that blows up the track. So everything that had been grounded is now floating out into space. And so what EMDR is supposed to help you do is kind of make these connections so that you can resolve whatever it is that's troubling you and kind of make sense of what's floating out there in space, which I know is complicated.
Yeah, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Wow.
Correct.
Okay.
So one of the things that you do with EMDR is you kind of start with, and it can be anything. It's like you want to target something that's troubling you in some way. So it could be a bad dream, it could be an experience, it could be anything that's troubling you that you want to resolve in some way. But to kind of pivot back to your earlier question about, well, how is this connected to my weight? It was interesting that once I started working with my therapist, and again, I was very good at losing weight. So the fact that I, again, was embarking on a diet and I lost weight was not significant because I did it all the time. But once I started working with her, I never regained the weight. So I ultimately lost 100 pounds and I never regained it. And it's been 16 years since I had lost it all. So it's interesting that in a lot of ways, once we did start dealing with the root cause of my issue, my weight became the easiest thing to manage, which is not to say that I wasn't still tortured by the way I looked. And, but I think a lot of that is being female, to be honest with you.
Now, you explored a number of alternative therapy methods, but why do you think the one you mentioned, the EMDR, why do you think that was the one that helped?
I actually think they all helped. We'll put a caveat on that. So when I started working with my therapist, again, my end goal was to really get to a place where, again, I found myself repellent because I didn't like the way I looked. So I assumed all men found me repellent. And I wanted to lose weight and maintain it so that I could find love. I wanted to have a relationship. And so when I started working with my therapist and I started losing weight, and I made a lot of progress, I really did. But it got to a point where I was just stuck. And suddenly it's like, it's obviously not about the way I look, right? Like, because I had lost the weight. But I still wasn't meeting anybody. And at that point, she and I always worked together, and I started exploring additional therapies. So the first one it's called chiropractic care. And I thought that was incredibly helpful as well. Again, I had never heard of these things, but I am lucky that I live in New York City and pretty much anything under the sun you can find here. And basically the thinking behind this was that anything that happens to you is kind of trapped in your body. And so it's almost as if you are trapped in a perpetual fight or flight mode. And so you work with a therapist who specializes in chiropractic care to kind of release all this trapped energy from the body.
I'd love to ask you, and you shared a little bit about it, but what was your healing process like? Like, what steps within you did you have to take?
I think honestly it was a very, very long journey, and all in, I was in therapy for 12 years, which I'm a very goal-oriented kind of person. And had I known that, I think I would have been so dismayed by the answer that I don't know that I would have stuck with it. But I didn't know the answer, and my therapist didn't know the answer, and it was something I asked all the time. When will I be done? When will I be done? When will I be done? She's always like, I don't know. Nobody knows. You'll be done when you're done. And again, I had very specific goals. So I think for me, part of it was, even though, and I made progress day after day. I really did. And it's not a zero-sum game. So it's like you become incrementally happier and less troubled every day. So I kept going. And because I had a goal at the end to have a relationship, I never stopped until I got there. And it took me a very long time, which is how I managed to work with my therapist in EMDR that entire time, but then also explore these other therapies, including chiropractic care. I worked with a sex therapist for a short while. I ultimately did group therapy for sexual abuse. I mean, I really left no stone unturned to resolve my issues.
Wow. Well, it's wonderful that you were able to resolve that trauma within you, because, I mean, that is huge, a huge trauma to deal with. And I have to say, many people, maybe even some of the listeners of this show, are survivors of child sexual trauma. So what would you like to say to them to encourage them?
So I think, sadly, I would be stunned if a good number of your community weren't also, unfortunately, didn't experience childhood sexual abuse. 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys are sexually abused, which is a staggering number. And it's heartbreaking. And it's interesting that I never dealt with my sexual abuse, and I never talked about it, and I never focused on it because it was so deeply shameful. And I really felt ruined by the whole thing. And, I think it's interesting that we've talked about the fact that I wrote a book, and I really detail all the therapies that I explored. And one of the things that's been a very interesting offshoot of my book is that I've had to tell people about it, right? Like, if I want anybody to read it, people need to know what it's about. So it's really been this whole process of me being able to say the words about what it is about. And as I've been doing that, there are certainly any number of people that tell me, unfortunately, that they have similar experiences to mine. And really, it is so sad. It happens all the time. And then there's a whole group of people that are just very sympathetic and they can't imagine what that's like. But then there's another whole group of people who really are like deer in the headlights. Like, they just can't even understand what it is I'm saying or take it in. And I think that reluctance to acknowledge that this happens allows it to be perpetuated again and again and again. I mean, because if you think about how many children this affects, like, it should outrage us all. And yet it still goes on.
And I can tell you what an alarming, shocking number, 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 5 boys. Well, I can tell you that I was on jury duty once, and that was the case, was a gentleman who was accused of sexual abuse of a minor. And, the judge goes through the process of picking the jurors, and there were many of us that just could not sit on the jury. I mean, I was one of them. I just said, I can't. I mean, I'm in education, I'm a mother, and there's no way that I could carry him through the due process of law, even though that's what he deserves, right? Everyone is supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. But it's just like, when it comes to something like that, childhood sexual trauma, that anyone preying upon any child or anyone suspecting that, it's hard to stomach,
Oh, yeah.
That's just a very sad thing. And all the stories we hear about people preying upon young people sexually, when young people don't even have that part of their brain or mind is not even developed to even understand what's happening to them. It's just very, very sad.
That is an excellent point you just made, the last part about not being able to understand it. And I think that was a lot of what came up when I was in therapy, like, especially because when all was said and done, my issues with men were not that they didn't find me attractive. It was none of those things. It was that I was putting out these signals that, do not approach, do not approach, do not approach. And so we kept trying to figure out, like, why? What is it about? Because I seem so capable and so able to defend and protect myself. But there was a part of me that really didn't believe that I could, because I couldn't then. And I couldn't then because I couldn't understand what was happening, right? Like, I mean, and that was a lot of what we talked about, how I would get around men. I would be confused. And I would be confused because my experience happened at a point where I just couldn't make sense of them. And whenever I was in any kind of like a romantic or a sexual situation, that's the part of me that would take back over. Like, that became my template. And unfortunately, I think, again, no matter what the abuse is, it becomes your template for normal, and it is anything but normal.
No, definitely. It's not normal at all. So you wrote your memoir, Not That Girl Anymore, which I love the title, by the way.
Thank you.
Where did you find the courage to be vulnerable and share your story?
So when I started therapy, and again, I told nobody about my past, nobody, none of my friends, nobody. It was something I did not discuss. And when I started therapy, it was a lot. Like, you are dealing with so many emotions and so much is coming up. And I really wasn't sharing it with anybody. So what I would do is I would go see my shrink. I would come home. I'm a writer, and I would write about my sessions as a way to process them. And I did it for 12 years. So I had never planned to write a book. There was no volition behind it. It was like never. It was just the only way for me to make sense of what was happening, because I wouldn't talk to anybody about it. And I had been in therapy for several years before I started telling my friends about my history. So I was very closed. So the book was really, or the basis for the book was my only way to make sense of everything that I was feeling and dredging up and all of it. And I finally did meet someone. And I finally did. I finally, arrived at the promised land. I finally had a relationship, which was wonderful and terrifying. And, it was like, still, it was a lot. And it was at that point, several months in, where I thought one day I was out and I was like, wow, I have been taking copious notes about everything that I'm experiencing. I should write a book, because I'm probably not the only one, and it was at that point that kind of the genesis for my book was born. But I have to say, that was 8 years ago. So for a long time, I thought, maybe I'll write a book, but I don't ever have to do anything with it. Maybe it's for me. Maybe it's to, make sense of it for me, or maybe it's to share it with my friends so I can be more vulnerable. So it really was an evolution for me to finally get to a point where I was like, oh, maybe I should publish it.
Well, that's awesome. So now, after going through therapy, having, this resolution within you for your past, and then now writing this book, what is your approach to love now after your healing?
I would say a lot of the things that I tortured myself about before I finally met someone was I really struggled with, what should I tell someone about me, And I think too, and I think this is also not uncommon, I think that I was so loath to go out and try and meet people, because I didn't feel like I was entitled to set the boundaries that I needed to set to feel safe or to be comfortable. And again, I think that was very, very common. And so for me, it was easier just not to even try. And I think one of the big things that's come out of it is that I've realized that I don't need to go out with anybody that I'm not interested in seeing. I have a choice. I get to say yes or no. And the only person's feelings, honestly, who really matter are mine. So if I'm not interested in somebody, I don't have to see him again. Like, I get to say no. And I also think that holds true with what you reveal to somebody. If I really, and that was kind of one of my big epiphanies too, was that, when I finally met someone, and I had tried dating and it was torturous for me, but I always struggled with, what am I going to tell them? What am I going to tell them? What am I going to tell them? And one of the things that had happened to me was I had this huge aversion to kissing, because I just really disliked kissing. And it made it really difficult for what I perceived to be the beginning and ending of dates, because you kiss, and I didn't like kissing. So it was like I couldn't even fake it to make it. It really was something that was present for me right at the beginning. And what I kind of realized when all was said and done was, if I really like someone and he likes me, he's going to let me take it as slow as I need to, which the man that I ultimately ended up finding did. And I'm going to get to reveal what I want to, not because I have to, but because I want to be known. And that was something I had never wanted. I always wanted to be hidden. I always wanted to be invisible. And then it was like, suddenly, no, I can be known. I can be seen. It's okay.
That is an interesting thing in dating, as you mentioned, because I'm also dating and after divorce and trying to navigate that and figure it out. The fact of how much do you reveal and when exactly do you reveal it? Because you never know. It's like you could meet someone and it's great, and it's like 30 days in and you reveal all kinds of stuff, and then it falls apart, and now you've told this person all your business. Right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
difficult, and then you don't know, okay, what things can I tell someone that's not going to run them off? It's like, what do you share? How much do you share, and when?
Oh, exactly. And, I do think it's interesting because it doesn't matter what your experience is. Like, again, you're on the heels of a divorce or what have you, but I'm online dating too. And it's like, now that I wrote a book, I mean, let's be honest, you Google everybody Googles everybody now, right? Like, especially I think with, especially if you're like looking for men, I think there's more of a safety issue. Am I going out with somebody who's an axe murderer? You know what I mean? Like, you want to know. and I had actually met somebody, and we had a great time, and then I went home and Googled him and whatever. He was fine, but it was interesting because I thought, I wonder what comes up if you Google me, because I was kind of stunned at how much came up about him. And I Googled myself, and the first thing that came up was my book, and I thought, oh my God, my life is right out there. Like, how do I tell someone about that? Like, it's interesting. But I will say, with this gentleman who I had met, one of the things too, and again, I'm of a certain age at this point, and I really do think you get to a point in your life where, and certainly with your experiences, you have children, you're divorced, it's like, it's no longer okay just to be superficial. Like, you need somebody who's willing to go deep. And you would hope that with age and introspection based on your life experiences, you really have an understanding of yourself. But not everybody wants to be known. So I feel like for me, that's the big thing. It's like, I don't just want to shoot the breeze with you. I want to know. I want to know how you feel.
Absolutely. And speaking of feeling, which you've mentioned a few times that you've met someone, and so the question is, are you perhaps in love now, or is it brewing, and if so, like, how is it for you?
No, I am not. That relationship ended, and I will say one of the things I talk about in the book too, in addition to all these other therapies that I had tried, I also took up meditation. And meditation everything I did helped me on the path, right? Like, there's no denying that. And I will forever be grateful that I was able to keep going and found them all. But meditation somehow or other is the single most transformative thing I've done, and I still do it. And I think one of the things that came out of me meditating was, I really feel like I am in sync with the universe, and I want what the universe wants, even when it's painful, because even when things are painful, there can still be a lot of growth and great things that come out of it. Just because you don't realize it today doesn't mean it won't be revealed to you a month from now, a year from now, what have you. So the relationship that I was in was amazing. It was revelatory and transformative, and I was so happy, and it was so terrifying and so painful, and I mean, it was all of it. It was a lot for me to navigate. It really was. And I was, still working with my therapist, and she had said to me at one point, she was like, you have defended against being where you are right now for your entire life. So it's like your brain is in revolt. And even though I knew intellectually he wouldn't hurt me, there's still the fear. Like, will I be hurt? What will someone do to me?
I totally understand that. I divorced because of domestic abuse. And so, going into the dating and, any type of argument or tension, it does bring up, like, even though I've been through therapy and all of that, but it does make you cautious, and you never know what those triggers are within you. Well, hey, Patty, I'll let you, I'll definitely say, of course, it doesn't make us less than if we're not in a relationship, but I'm going to root for the both of us to find our forever person.
I am too, and I am so sorry to hear about your experiences. That's terrible.
Yeah.
But good for you that you are protecting yourself. You removed yourself from the situation, and it only makes you stronger, right? Like, you got to the other side of that, and I hope that there is somebody wonderful out there for you, and I'm sure there is.
I believe so. I haven't given up on love.
Yeah, no, exactly. I agree.
So in your opinion, what are the best ways to build resilience?
I think We all get knocked down in life, right? Like that's life. We all get knocked down, and the ability to get up and keep going is really what's going to determine how happy we are. And I think if you have someone to talk to about what's troubling you, that's fantastic, because I think that's really important so that you don't feel so alone. And I had felt very alone for a very long time, but I am grateful that I found my therapist. I would say, if you're somebody who's just an internal processor who is always thinking about your own stuff all the time, I think it's helpful to really try and have some perspective on what's happening. A lot of times things can seem like it's the end of the world, like I'll never recover from this. But you know what? You will. And it's important to remember that, it's always darkest before the dawn. So what is dark can become light. Things pass. Unfortunately, good times pass, but bad times pass too. So it's just really about, and I think, again, with meditation, that what I found so powerful about meditation was meditation is all about now. Meditation just wants you to be present, not looking ahead and not looking behind. And I was always looking ahead, and I was never in the moment. And so with meditation, you're in the moment, and I tried to apply that to my life. So I don't need to worry about tomorrow. I just need to think about today. And if that means I need to think about this second in front of me, that's fine. But that's as far as I'm looking, because I think it can be overwhelming for people to look, what's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen next week? Where am I going to be next year? You know what? Worry about that when you get there. Just focus on now.
No, absolutely. Well, Patty, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you. Please take the time to let everyone know how they can get a copy of your book, Not That Girl Anymore.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Rowe. I had such a good conversation with you. My book is available for free on my website. You can download the PDF at pattycabot.com. It's pattycabot.com. If you wanted a Kindle version or your own softcover, you can order from Amazon or anywhere you order books.
Any last words of encouragement for the listeners?
Actually, I do. And, one of the things that we didn't really touch on, but I want to make sure that everybody knows, because I do think childhood sexual abuse is so common. Whatever happened, if you were sexually abused, whatever happened to you, it's not your fault. And that's the most important thing to remember. And I think for me, that was my big stumbling block. I think, again, when we talk about children, they always assume everything's their fault, because if nobody else takes responsibility, well, then who else's fault would it be? So for anybody out there, just know that whatever happened to you, it is not your fault. It's not your blame. It's not your shame. And you don't need to keep the secrets anymore.
No, that's absolutely true. Well, Patty, I wish you and your family nothing but blessings and abundance. Please take care.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rowe, and right back to you.
Hey, are you really loving this podcast, or did you really enjoy this week's episode? Then please subscribe, like, rate, and leave a review. It's very much appreciated. And remember to live, laugh, love, learn, and then repeat. See you in the next episode.